But I'm joined now by Washington Post chief correspondent covering politics, Dan Balz. In his latest article, Dan argues that the Senate, not the House, will provide most of the drama on election night. Fascinating, Dan, to read your piece. Thanks so much for being with us. Tell us, why is the Senate the chamber that we should have our eye on?
Well, I think what I'm really trying to say is don't lose sight of this, that if you're looking for sheer drama on election night, it may be the Senate that provides it. One is, look, the House is clearly at this point the more important story, because if Democrats take control of the House, and they obviously have a very good chance to do so, they will be in control. They will be able to launch investigations. They will be able to issue subpoenas. They will be able to put roadblocks in the path of the president and the congressional Republicans in ways that they have not been able to do during his first 2 years. So that alone will fundamentally change the balance of power in the conversation in Washington. But the Senate is so interesting in part because it could go either way. It is quite possible that the Democrats could narrowly end up in control, or they could be somewhat more in the minority than they are today. And on top of that, I think what's interesting is that there are so many of these races that at this point look like they are, virtually even, if not even, in the polling that we're seeing. So as these races, and they go, across the country, from Florida to Nevada and Arizona, we're going to be in a series of time zone changes that will continue to keep that drama unfolding. We may not know till the end of that night, and maybe somewhat after that, if these races go into recounts, just who controls the Senate.
Well, so I want to take your crystal ball for a moment and look ahead to November 7th, the day after the midterms. And I want to point out that for people who aren't familiar with Dan Balz is the kind of reporter that when he speaks political Washington, sits up and takes notice. So your analysis here is so valuable. If the Democrats take control of the Senate, what do you think it is that political reporters will be pointing to as the reason they were able to pull it off?
Well, my guess is that if that is the case, what we will be talking about is a big Democratic wave, not just a moderate wave that puts the Democrats just over what they need to hold the power in the House, but something substantially larger. I mean, in reporting out this piece, one of the Republicans that I was in conversation with indicated that the thing that makes this person worry at night is this notion of a kind of a global force politically that washes Republicans away in a much larger sense than we've seen. And this is not unprecedented. In 1994, we saw a huge wave that the Republicans were able to win the House after 40 years of Democratic control. In 2010, there were not many people who were predicting that the Republicans were going to pick up 63 seats in the House of Representatives. So when a wave hits, it sometimes hits with greater force than people are anticipating. And I think if the Democrats are able, because the map is so challenging for them, if they are able to win control of the Senate, it will be because this blue wave, so to speak, turned out to be pretty powerful.
Well, let me ask you more specifically about that map. What states do you see as the most likely path to victory here for Democrats?
Well, they have two challenges. The first is that, as you indicated, they are defending a lot of seats, and they're defending 10 seats in states that Donald Trump won in 2016. In particular, 5 of those 10 are in what we would call very red states. I mean, Montana, for example, West Virginia, that he won by 40 points. The Democrats who are in those seats have a real challenge. How do they navigate through a state in which Trump has substantial support? They are the incumbent. They've got to find a way to say to people, I'm with Trump when he's good for the state. I'm not going to be with the president when he's not good for the state, and hope that gets them through. So they have to hold almost all of those 5 seats that are most endangered. Then beyond that, there are a handful of seats, 3 or 4, depending on how you want to define it, where they have an opportunity to pick up seats from the Democrats, from the Republicans. Arizona is one, Nevada is another. Tennessee is a little bit more challenging, but they have an opportunity there to pick up a seat. And even Texas, Beto O'Rourke against Ted Cruz, Senator Cruz, in a very red state, ought to be in pretty good shape, but Beto O'Rourke has run a campaign that's captured the imaginations of people. That's a little more difficult. But if they can win 2 or 3 of those and hold the rest, they'll end up in control.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just curious. What do you think is happening there in Texas? You mentioned a little bit about Beto O'Rourke essentially capturing the imaginations there of some voters, but what specifically is it? Because to think about that particular contest and where it is right now might have been inconceivable, you know, just 12 months ago, to think that this would even be competitive for Democrats.
Democrats have had their hearts broken in Texas for a long time. Yeah. And this could be another case in which they get their hopes up and only to see them dashed. I think there are a couple of things. One is that Donald Trump only won that state by about 9 points, which is less than most Republicans had been winning it. Now, George W. Bush obviously was a favorite son, so he did quite well. But Trump's performance in Texas was not overwhelming. That's one thing. Second, we know the state is changing. We know that the demographics of that state are changing with more and more Latinos in the mix. That doesn't guarantee anything, but it gives Democrats a little bit more to work with. A third factor, frankly, is that Ted Cruz is not the most likable politician in the land. Right. I mean, when he was in the Senate, there were, as he is now, there were a lot of even Republicans who did not think of him as their favorite colleague. So there's that. And finally, Beto O'Rourke has run a campaign that is unorthodox. He's not following the path of most candidates of having a lot of consultants. He's all over the state. He's making his own message, and he has captured people's imaginations. There's just a great deal of interest in him. Now, whether that adds up to a victory, which would be, again, I would say surprising, or whether he comes just short, or ends up, as some other Democrats have, farther behind than a lot of people think he will be. We don't know. But that race is clearly on everyone's radar now. And as you say, it wasn't a year ago.
I want to ask you about a clip that we played earlier in the show. Former President Obama campaigning at, I believe, your alma mater, University of Illinois. Is that right? Urbana-Champaign. Yes. Mine too, by the way. So go Illini. But what is the calculus here for Democrats in choosing to deploy President Obama? Because earlier in the show we were talking about the calculus of trying to decide whether or not having the former president in certain areas would actually help or hurt Democratic candidates. What is the challenge there?
It's a difficult challenge, frankly. I mean, for one, it goes against the history of presidents once they're out of office of not being so deeply involved in politics and going after the other party. They try often to stay above the fray. But we're in unusual times, obviously, and I think that this is, for Democrats, a kind of an all-hands-on-deck moment, and I think that the former president feels that pressure. We know he has strong views about President Trump, which he enunciated during the 2016 campaign when he was out working for Secretary Clinton. I'm sure those views have not changed, as he made clear when he was at the University of Illinois last Friday. But as you say, there's a question as to whether he helps or hurts, or how much more he can help than he might hurt. We know he will stir up Republicans. We know there's a lot of animosity toward him still within the Republican base. How much does he energize them as he's trying to turn out Democrats? But the other side of that is Democrats need turnout, strong turnout from young voters and voters of color. And both of those groups were not as strong in their turnout in 2016 as the Democrats needed, and they fell short. If he is able to do that, if he is able to energize young voters, and I think that's obviously why he was at the U of I on Friday, then he can contribute in a significant way. He's not going to necessarily go everywhere. He will go where he thinks he and what the party thinks he can be most helpful. But that voice resonates beyond those particular areas where he's campaigning. So once he's out there, and everybody's going to hear that, and we'll see what that balance is in terms of whether the turnout is energized significantly as a result of him being out there. I'd add one more thing to that, and that is we did not see that he was particularly effective in 2010 and 2014 in transferring the support that he had to other candidates. That's the challenge that President Trump has this fall, and I think it's all the more the case with the former president. Can he, in a sense, rekindle that enthusiasm and convince people to vote for Democrats even when he's not on the ballot.
Yeah, that's going to be really fascinating to watch and see how that plays out. All right, Chief Correspondent at the Washington Post, Dan Balz. Dan, such a pleasure to have you. Thank you so much.
Thanks, my pleasure.